Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, so I think I kick it off. Today is an awesome day. It is the publishing date of the book Interop, so very special to have John here. And it is also, Venus is doing something crazy in the sky. I think it's like passing by the sun or something. Not quite sure, but we wouldn't know here. Anyway, just want to welcome you all. Thanks for coming to the lecture series. And we're super lucky to have John here. John is awesome. He helped found the Berkman Center, and he is an expert on sort of the internet and society and how it impacts youth, and how these interconnected systems are really changing the way we live and provide all kinds of new opportunities and challenges. And so he's a good friend of lots of us here, and I just want to thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Lily, thank you so much. This is a real pleasure to be here, and it is no surprise, at least from my perspective, that I'm here in Seattle and at Microsoft on publication date, because actually this book owes a lot to many of you who are in the room. I'm a great admirer of MSR and Lily, your lab, and everything going on here. My great friend Tom Rubin, who's consistently from your legal team come to the Harvard Law School, even though he didn't graduate from Harvard Law School to teach with us. And in particular, a group of people who are represented here in the room from the Interop team at Microsoft. Actually, a lot of the work on this book dates back to conversations from 2005 and 2006 with people here, in particular Nick Seles, who I'm deeply grateful for all the wisdom he has shared with us on this topic over the years. So it's a great pleasure to be here on PubDate with all of you. We had a funny experience earlier where some people on the team that we were talking to had bought the book on Kindle but hadn't been able to read it. And Tom had the old school version of it, just like this, and it had been available much earlier in analog hard copy, but for whatever reason it wasn't released on Kindle until the publication date, until this morning. So yet another one of the ironies, which is a little bit Interop related, and we'll get back to that. But I'm delighted that now it's available in digital form as well as analog, and that you're all here to talk about it. I'm going to try to talk no more than about a half hour, and then hopefully have time for some questions. I learn a ton when I'm here on this campus, and I look forward to today being no exception about that. What I wanted to do by way of introduction of the book was to run through some of the case studies that we have been using as the grist for the mill in making an argument about interoperability. This is a book I wrote. I should note right off the bat, my better half in this effort is a man named Urs Gasser, who is a incredibly good law professor. He's Swiss by background. He's now the executive director of the Berkman Center, but we've had a long partnership in this effort, and he actually would give a better version of this talk were he here, so I should acknowledge him before getting going too. The source of this project does come from conversations here at Microsoft and elsewhere in the IT space, and it started with a very basic question, which was trying to answer whether or not this thing that we often think of as a good thing, interoperability, is in fact a driver of innovation. That was the core question. In the IT setting, if you have higher levels of interop, do you have more innovation? That's where we started in this. And I think the answer, after a bunch of different work, was yes, by and large, higher levels of interoperability drive higher levels of innovation. But the book project, the one that resulted in this form of the argument, is trying to do something broader and more ambitious. And admittedly, we might have failed. I will accept that, that it was so ambitious in one respect that you can tell us that we've reached too far. But the effort was to say that interoperability is something that does make sense and is important on a campus like this one and has a lot to do with technology and data, but in fact that it has more to do in many respects with other kinds of interoperability, with human interoperability, the way that people work together, and frankly how institutions work together, how things like legal systems work together. So what we're trying to do is make a broader argument about interoperability, that it's not just an IT story, and in fact it's something that goes to the core of many of the urgent problems that we're trying to solve today: climate change, healthcare reform, and so forth. That's the much broader and more ambitious argument that I'm going to try to make over the course of this half hour, and I would welcome your telling us that we've overreached or if we've gotten it right. I think no matter where you look after you get into Interop, you see Interop stories everywhere. And I admit now, once you become sort of an Interop geek, it's sort of unstoppable. So it's a fair warning. Don't read the book or think too much about it if you don't want to start seeing Interop everywhere you turn. I'm going to give 3 examples that have been in the paper in the last few days. I think the story about Facebook and its IPO, which is in some respects being told as one about a valuation and whether or not it's really worth $100 billion or $80 billion, or no matter what, you guys got a good deal when you invested in it. I'm quite sure that that much is resolved. But most of the discussion about Facebook has been the question of whether its ad sales can support this valuation and so forth. I actually think that it's an Interop story in many respects, that one of the reasons that were I to invest in Facebook, it would be on the basis of the extent to which their design has been, at least to a large extent, still to be determined, but has been about building an interoperable platform. That when they opened their very popular platform to third-party application developers and had 4,000 applications developed in a short period after that, and the way in which they have become so deeply ingrained in the mobile infrastructure and the lives, frankly, of our kids, the people that Lily and I study, that it's this degree of interoperability that Facebook has achieved at multiple levels that has set it apart from things like Friendster and MySpace, which are obviously worth 0, but also, I think, which set it apart, for instance, from LinkedIn, which is worth a mere $10 billion, right? So I actually think there is a reason, a rationale in interoperability that helps to explain part of that story. Second, kind of ripped from the headlines example of this week, you may have been following the flame virus and the extent to which Kaspersky Labs CEO Mr. Kaspersky has been running around talking about this worst ever virus and the extent to which the spread of it represents major cyber warfare threat and so forth, and tying that into discussions about how we need treaties to ban cyber warfare. I think this is hugely an Interop story as well, that the story about the ability for, whether it's a government or not, to unleash a certain amount of code that then may have a threat to Iran in this particular case, or any one given geography, but which cannot be contained ultimately across multiple boundaries, is about interoperability. It's about the rush to interconnect up to 200 countries around the world on a single network, and the extent to which, once we do that, there are potentially negative consequences. So this is one of the riffs in the book, which is, it is great to have Interop by and large. There is a yay Interop quality to the book. There's also a quality that says, be careful what we wish for. When we have these highly interoperable systems, that we also need to figure out what are the fire breaks, what are the speed bumps that we erect at various different borders to ensure that the interoperability doesn't come with too high of a series of costs. Third of 3 ripped from the headlines examples, you may be following the Greek Eurozone example, the idea that the failure of the banking system and the public pension system and so forth in Greece is affecting not just this one relatively small company, but is threatening the entire European Union and, frankly, all of our economies. Now, this is the part where we're reaching, obviously, a long way from this notion of IT, but I actually think that in these stories, we can see examples of interoperability in the nation-state context and in the international context. And if you think about the way in which interoperability has occurred in IT systems, it's not that dissimilar from the way in which it's developed in financial systems as well. If you think about economies that grew up on a local basis and a barter basis, and eventually you get some currency and trade within a given state, and then you get to these much more interconnected systems where if you have something like these derivatives that are being used and not well understood in one place, it can affect economies way further afield. That's especially and acutely so the case in the European Union. I think the EU is one of the best, most amazing interop stories, good and bad, that we've seen yet. This is obviously now much at the institutional level, not at the technology level, but I think the risk level that we're seeing with Greece is a good example of the spread of interop more broadly. Okay, so to back up and to try to ground the conversation, where we started, again in this conversation with Nick and others, was to say this is in the context of something like document formats, right? Or in the context of email systems. What is interoperability? And we adopted initially a very simple technical definition. I think NIST has done a lot of very good work in coming up with very complex technical definitions. So if you really want the what is interop one, I send you over to NIST. But we've worked with this relatively simple one, interop as the ability to transfer and render useful data across systems, including organizations, applications, and components. That's our working definition, what we mean by interop. But I think, again, as we look at the expanded play version, what we mean to be the ultimate punchline here, we think of Interop as the art and science of working together. In fact, when we sold this book to Basic Books, I had the subtitle as The Art and Science of Working Together. They thought that was too namby-pamby and no one would buy the book if it weren't the promise and perils of highly interconnected systems. However, I actually think that the art and science of working together is really the essence of Interop in this bigger and broader frame. So that's where we started from. And as I mentioned, the idea here was to work from a series of very technical arguments and then expand the argument out. We have done this on the basis of case studies. So those of you who are academics in the room or have been, to the question of methodology, we wanted to have a lot of empirical evidence, but it's actually very hard to find good empirical evidence for the relationship between Interop and other things. So we ended up using very rich, in-depth case studies and lots of interviews and so forth. We've looked at music in particular. DRM-protected music is a great early example. Mashups and lots of aspects of the social web, I think, are really important. We did a lot of deep work on digital identity systems. In fact, working earlier with Kim Cameron of Microsoft was a very big influence on our thinking around identity and interoperability. And these are all papers that we published online. And in many respects, the project of studying interoperability is not the book, but rather what we think of as a very deep set of cases that are online. So if you think about what is the book Interoperability, it's in a way the summary of a whole lot of arguments that we've put freely online. We've had a great research team working with us. The book, in a way, is only one kind of capstone of that. And it's meant to be a single narrative, and a single narrative that not academic and not geeky people would actually want to read, and that's the far reach of what we're trying to accomplish with this book. So I'm going to share with you just a couple of the case studies that we thought to be compelling. I'm going to leave out actually some of the biggest ones that we have in the book. For instance, I actually think healthcare reform and the electronic health records is one of the great examples. And if anybody here worked on the Vault projects or otherwise, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on it. But one that I think is really revealing is this idea of the move towards smart cities. So half the people in the globe live by one way or another in an urban area, and one of the big projects that many cities are working on is trying to overlay a fair amount of intelligence into the network. And just as one example, with the goal of trying to fight climate change. So I actually think Interop is a story about trying to solve some of the hardest problems on the planet by using technology, in this case the smart grid, the overlay of information on top of the old-fashioned grid as well. And from these different examples, like the smart cities or the smart grid, I think we can draw a bunch of observations that are useful across a series of different interoperability examples. Increasingly, when we try to solve a big societal problem, take climate change, that we need an interoperability strategy. That if you're a public policy maker or you are a big utility in this case, that you need to figure out how much interoperability you want, how you want to put it into place. And this goes to the core point about interoperability, which is it's not an on-off switch. Interoperability is not either there or not there. It comes in a variety of degrees. And I think historically, we have failed to see it as a core design challenge when we're building some of these complex systems. I think something like the smart cities example or the Internet of Things, something I talked earlier today with one of the teams at Microsoft about, it's ultimately a design challenge. It's best handled at the outset of a big project as a set of principles, as a framework for what we want to have, what's good about it, what it can accomplish, but also how we can maximize those benefits. So ultimately, we're making an argument in favor of interoperability, but not maximal interoperability, optimal interoperability at a certain level in order to accomplish other benefits. So the argument at its core is not about Interop for its own sake, but rather because it helps accomplish other benefits. Three examples of what those benefits are, and there are more. One is efficiency. I think most Interop solutions are driven because users want it for a variety of reasons. It makes it more efficient that using your smartphone you can access lots of different platforms directly, and that there's frustration if you don't. Second, user autonomy and choice, the ability, of course, to have more choice across a spectrum. And third, ultimately, I think we have found that our hunch about the relationship between interoperability and innovation is right, that by and large, higher levels of interoperability do lead to innovation and to economic growth. But I think it's crucial to make that point that there are interoperability solutions at multiple levels in a stack. As I mentioned before, technology and data are crucial aspects of this in many cases, but ultimately the harder cases and frankly the more important aspects are often at these human and institutional layers further up the stack. And with any of the interop challenges, I think this model helps to break it down. Okay, so that's example number one. Second example is open platforms, one that will resonate here. And I should say any number of these, in fact, probably all of them, could be made as Microsoft examples. I've chosen not to do that since you are my hosts. I thought that would be rude to be talking entirely about the pros and cons of something that's so close to home. So I've used other ones, but I think you could easily substitute. I think much of the debate over the development of Facebook and how it has emerged, again, is one about whether or not they are getting interoperability right. And I think there are two narratives here that are emergent. One is to say, yes, they opened up their platform for third-party developers to be able to create new applications and to create more innovation above it. Others argue, no, they've gotten interoperability wrong in a sense, which is they're building another walled garden on top of the open web. So I think that in the example of Facebook, you can see interop as a design challenge playing out very directly. I think second, Twitter is a really good example of it in the sense that they likewise have created an open platform, a web platform that is highly interoperable in many respects, that both Facebook and Twitter have created systems that function also as the identity layer for many people, that you can log into other applications via these things. This is another hallmark of these open platforms. And yet there are proprietary qualities to both, and whether or not they are getting it right, I think will have a huge impact on the outcome of their companies. Third example, and in some respects more profound, is the example of Yoush. You may be familiar with this very, very open platform. This is one that is open in every sense of the term. It was created by a graduate of the Harvard Law School, I'm proud to say, Aurea Kola, who hung out at the Berkman Center. And she created a platform with her colleagues in Kenya that could be used in particular in disaster circumstances to create support networks very, very quickly using an extremely interoperable and open platform. This example is one where a young man named Patrick Meyer sent out an email to a very large number of people at Tufts right after the Haiti disaster struck, and within hours they had set up this response system, helping people find help when they were in need, also figure out where infrastructure was having problems, and also where, in fact, certain people were when they had been lost. This was something that could happen extremely quickly, totally unthinkable without this very interoperable and open platform, and one that could be turned on at a moment's notice with no constraints and no intellectual property restrictions to worry about. From the sublime to the ridiculous, you can also see that in Harvard Square, if you were looking for a place to go to the bathroom in public, safe2p.org is another example of these open platforms, and it's actually pretty reliable, we found, at least in our neighborhood. Okay, so what can we glean from these open platforms? One of the things we've been testing is this question of whether or not interoperability leads to innovation via competition. And I think one thing that we can show, looking at the Facebook and Twitter type examples, but also the Yoush ones, is that yes, that is a fairly straightforward relationship, but you could also make the argument that it is interop leading to collaboration leading to innovation, and that sometimes the swapping out of that term actually makes as much sense as not. Second, we've been working, this is a truly geeky and academic thing to slide in here, but working with how much our theory works with the theories of others who have been trying to examine similar topics. So here are three, which I think are actually totally compatible or interoperable theories with our own. Our colleague Jonathan Zittrain has written a book called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. At the core of his book is an argument about generativity, the idea that we should favor platforms that allow for people to create innovative things on top of them. So the idea that generative platforms are the ones that we should protect. He's famously written about the extent to which early Microsoft, by allowing executables to be written on top of it, is a good example of a generative platform, and rethinking what the terms of open mean and why we're actually driving it. I think this design of generativity actually works well with this interop theory. Second, a colleague named Eric von Hippel, who works at MIT at the Sloan School, has done a lot of great work on user-driven innovation, peer innovation. I think, again, this is another example where the theory works very well compatibly. The notion that much of the innovation that we care about in this new environment is actually driven by peers. This is very much what I think Lily's working with in the new social platform, is allowing for peers to do a lot of the work together and to see a lot of the innovation as totally unexpected. The designers of the system can't anticipate what that innovation is going to be. Put people who are interesting together and see what great things come of it. And third, most familiar, I think, of the theories, Clay Christensen's designs around small step innovations, I think totally compatible with the findings that we've had. Small caveat, I think, that we found in looking at these examples is the extent to which competition and anti-competitive behavior are something to watch out for, particularly in the context of standards battles. We spent a lot of time on this, actually, talking with some of your Microsoft colleagues this morning, that often in an interop situation, you work very hard to come to a standard through an open standards process or otherwise, and there can be still anti-competitive activity within that context. The hold-up, for instance, using patents and the RAND licensing regime, which makes for not such reasonable pricing, is something to worry about. So there's not a direct line between higher levels of interop and more competitive situations. You can also have anti-competitive situations in that context. And I think you also can see instances in which innovation gets highly diffused and where the relationship between higher levels of interoperability don't lead directly to outcomes in the linear fashion that one might have hoped for. Okay, example number 3 that I think makes another set of points about interoperable systems. This is one that is now getting further afield from the core IT zone, but which is the familiar area of credit cards. It's a recent Pew study that helps us understand why people like credit cards, and as you can imagine, the primary thing is convenience. This is, I think, a really good example of how we've gone from standalone currencies to something that is extremely simple to use and yet brings with it some potential problems. So if you think about credit cards, they are fantastic in the sense of allowing you to pay anywhere. That is a great example of a deeply, deeply interoperable system. You can be anywhere in the world and use a common payment mechanism, even if the underlying currencies haven't been made to be the same. On the other hand, you have high concerns about things like privacy and security. I think this is one of the key points about interop, no matter what kind of context you're in, which is it often brings with it a series of new concerns. The most common concerns that we've seen are privacy and security in the IT context, but also diversity of systems. So we make the argument that interop is about diversity. In fact, it's saying not everything has to be the same in order for it to work together. On the other hand, if things get incredibly interoperable, it often does become homogeneous. You get the opposite result from diversity. On balance, though, I think systems like credit cards show that it's worth the risk. The fact that you can be more easily ripped off in some respects using credit cards doesn't mean we don't continue to use them. It just means we have to price that in and or find new systems to be able to offset it. But I think what it points to is at the outset in an interop problem, you have to assume that privacy and security, as well as things like diversity, may well become a problem, and you need to design for it at the outset. I think this is one of the things that a company like Facebook and Google in particular, where I think they have highly interoperable systems in many respects, Achilles heel is their Achilles heel in both cases is consumer privacy and the fear that they know too much about individuals, and that's driving the way in which people are starting to react against it. So I think when you get to higher levels of interop, you need to presume that some of these problems may come with it. Just to use a graphic illustration of it, I think as we connect systems more completely, the point is not that it is necessarily less secure or less private. You could imagine a system in which you have many, you could think about a lab, for instance. You could have a lab with one door in that is extremely secure or not secure. You could have that same lab with 100 doors to it, and it might be more or less secure. The fact of having more points of contact doesn't make it more or less private or secure. The point is just that you have to manage for a higher level of complexity when you do have interop. So it's something that I think from the outset as a design principle needs to be built in. And I don't think it's inherently to say things that are interoperable are less private or less secure. It's just that you know that that's going to be a problem and one that you have to try to sort for. Okay, example number 4. Mobile phone chargers. This is one that is less for the technologists in the room, but more just as kind of a way to talk about it in a public sense. I don't know how many people have bags and bags of different kinds of mobile chargers. This one I bought earlier today for the purpose of showing it. It's the most ridiculous, like Frankenstein thing, made by Duracell, and it says it's a 5-in-1 charger. And you can, I will throw out these other ones that don't work in my system, and you can use it in your car. You can use it in your, whatever. The notion that this is a product, right, that's sold at the Office Depot, to me is completely ridiculous, right? And we've got bags and bags of them at home. How do we get to this point that there are so many different kinds of chargers, and we don't, in fact, do what's right for the environment, or more simply, what's right for consumers? I think there's a really great story behind these chargers. Here are 3 silly examples. So I don't know if you've seen these possible ways to charge it. This is sort of a gas mask-like thing that you wear, and that will help charge your iPod there. This one uses wind power. You can get the wind to spin that around, and that will charge it. And then this is my personal favorite. This is the one that relies on your cat. If you get the cat to chase that ball of yarn around, that will charge up your cell phone. But it seems to me this is a really good example of the silliness of some of the unfettered market in certain contexts. Achieving interoperability, even though we can all laugh about why don't we have a relatively standardized mode of charging our cell phones or other devices, but ultimately I think it just shows the difficulty of creating interoperability with nothing to do with technology. This is not obviously a technology story. It's not hard for us to say, okay, micro USB is the way to go. The issue is that there are a lot of actors involved who each seem to have their own market incentives. Second, which we see over and over again in these stories, there are legacy providers who don't particularly want to make any adjustment to what they're doing in any situation. And then third, the complexity of solving the problem. Given that there are so many different kinds of cell phone chargers, what would be the approach? How should we go about getting to a higher level of interoperability? And this is another one of the core findings of our work, which is that there isn't a single way to get to interoperability. We had a review of this book, which came out the other day in Nature magazine, which I'm delighted about. I'm grateful if anyone from Nature is watching. The fact that you spelled our name right is fabulous, and we have a page in your great magazine about it. But it was an overall positive review, but there were 2 criticisms. And one criticism was that we didn't pay enough attention to the story of the web itself and the importance of open standards. And we do take this up, and there's a longer conversation there. We believe that open standards are a great way to do it. But we don't believe that there is any single way to get to interoperability. And in the second critique in this particular review, we were taken to task for not giving a prescription for interoperability. How do you get to interop in any given way? And the approach that we take in this book is to offer a framework, a series of possible approaches in various different circumstances. And I think ultimately that the example of cell phone chargers or others helps to illustrate this point, which is there's not one way to make all cell phone chargers more highly interoperable. The point is that there are a range of options using the public sector and the private sector that can help get there. In the case of cell phone chargers, though we have a highly diverse as we can see from this nice Duracell product, array of ways to charge your cell phone in the United States and still not a high degree of interoperability. In Europe, there's a much higher degree of interoperability around micro USB. And the way that this worked was that the European Commission said, we are going to legislate if you guys don't get your act together. We actually see this as an environmental problem. We see this as a market problem. And this was legislation by threat, or legislation by the form of a sword of Damocles held above the companies and telling them to get it done. This is much more likely to happen in Europe, by the way, than in the US, of course, from a regulatory perspective. But I think it's an example that shows there are multiple ways that we can get there. And in fact, it's important to have them all on the table. This is the most geeky slide that I will show, but this is in some ways the heart of the argument of the book, which is looking at a very broad range of possible ways to get at interoperability. On the top, you see sort of generally going in that direction are what we think of as unilateral approaches. The ones going further down are more or less collaborative ones with multiple parties participating. And the chart goes in two other directions, to left and right. To the left, showing non-regulatory approaches, generally speaking, led by private actors, and going to the right, ones that are more or less driven as regulatory approaches by state actors. And at the core of our argument is the notion that there are many ways to get there, and in different circumstances we should use different tools. And there are benefits and costs of using each of these different approaches. So in the bottom left are open standards initiatives, and I'm a big fan of open standards initiatives. I actually think they can get to very stable outcomes and have been terrific in the context of the web and the internet. But I think they also are in play alongside something like IP licensing. You could have a regime where the state is not involved and multiple parties come together and say we're going to license technologies and make them work together. I think it's implausible to argue that you can't get to a certain level of higher interoperability by virtue of using this form of private ordering. In the top right is the set of approaches that likewise could work, but that I think we're most skeptical of in many instances, which is the state mandating a particular standard. I think particularly in the case of information technology, there aren't a lot of good instances where the state has done a great job of saying this is the right standard and everybody should use it. On the other hand, I should say there are some case studies, for instance, with respect to emergency communication around boats, where I think it's a reasonably good approach for the state to say, you know what, when you're in a certain emergency situation, this is what you have to say. This is the rule here. There's not a lot at risk in terms of getting that wrong from an innovation perspective, but there's a lot to be gained from saving people's lives by virtue of the state stepping in. So while I think that generally speaking, the kinds of approaches that are more collaborative and more non-regulatory tend to work very well in the complex systems like IT, I think we have to keep on the table the fact that these are all ways in which we can get ultimately to interop. Okay, last example, and then I'd love to get into a bit of dialogue if you're willing. This one is most near and dear in a way to my heart at the moment. I'm working with some colleagues and friends in the room on this topic, which is how libraries actually are an interop problem to some extent. So this may seem not obvious. I'll take a little bit of time to spool it out. But I think there are two ways in which we can see a deeply embedded interop problem in the preservation of knowledge. And I think there's one that's in the near term and one that's in the longer term. The topic for the near term is about the lending of books. So one of the things that libraries are completely up in arms about today, and very, very worried, in particular public libraries, but also academic libraries, is the idea that it is very hard, if not impossible, for them to get their hands on electronic versions of books to be able to lend to patrons. So just as we've seen in the market sense a knee in the curve, this huge uptick in terms of people using and preferring ebooks, libraries are having a hard time getting them. Actually, let me just, out of curiosity, if you were offered the chance to read a new book, just take any old book like this one or another one, in an electronic format versus a print format, be curious, how many people would read the ebook? How many people would take the hard copy book? It's almost exactly 50-50, which is interesting. It's trending, having done this a lot for the last several years, trending very much more in this direction, that it's more or less half. But if you're a public library and you're saying, okay, I want to meet the needs of our users. First of all, there's a problem of having to buy it in two formats because you end up paying twice. I'm sorry to say to publishers, this is a problem for libraries. They end up buying fewer titles in multiple formats to meet the needs of their users. But 5 of the 6 major publishers today will not sell a book to a library to let them lend it as an ebook. Only Random House will let them do that, and on the basis of you buy it and then you can lend it to one person at a time. So 5 of 6 major publishers will not let any books be lent in this way, and there are emerging ecosystems here that are not particularly interoperable. So for instance, if you have a series of users, one has Nook, one has Kindle, one has iPad, and so forth, and you have very highly encumbered DRM systems for these books, what's a library to do? How do you make a system that is in fact free to all, that in fact is meeting the core job of libraries in the digital era, it's sort of a perverse situation. It's actually worse in the digital era than it is in the analog from the perspective of libraries. And there's a version of this that is particularly worrisome over time. And I think this is the other way in which libraries and books represent a really good interop story. So sticking with the libraries for a second, one of the things we fear is that as we spend our collection budgets, which are billions of dollars a year around the world in terms of library collection budgets, we are going from entities that buy books like this and put them in a storage space and people can come and access them, which increasingly they don't want to do, pulling them off the shelf in this way, but at least you have them over time, to ones who lease or rent those materials. And if you stop paying the lease payment, you don't actually have the works, right? This is a substantial problem over time for libraries that they're really struggling with. The other version of this problem is interoperability of the formats over time. So if you think about 3.5-inch floppy disks or 5.25-inch floppy disks, these things that change so quickly, or the little USB sticks today, think about the timeline over which we've had this particular technology of a book, right? This has lasted for, 1,000 years plus in some respects. Even microforms, this is something that can last for hundreds of years as a format. But if our digital formats are lasting 5 years or 10 years, we're going to have potentially an issue if all publishers are publishing in lots of different formats, and then we get to a place in which libraries don't have the materials themselves to bring forward. I think we have a mess on our hands from the perspective of the preservation of knowledge. And again, this weird, perverse situation that ultimately it may be worse in a digital era than in a physical era. I think there's an interop solution to this interop problem as well. I'm working with several of the people in this room and many elsewhere on a project called the Digital Public Library of America. And the idea would be, among other things, to create a place in which we would have deposits or repository of these works in a digital format, that if the publishers didn't have it or otherwise, you would have a place where you could do that reformatting in a common way over time, so that if you have some way in which you can bring it forward, make it interoperable over time, we'd be in a better space. Lily?
Do you have the same issue with music and videos and movies?
You have almost exactly the same issue, and with music and with video. In fact, the hardest case is the one that you are creating, Lily, in your labs, which is interactivity. So to the extent that libraries increasingly want to have in their collection things that are games or things that are an interactive web space like social, is there some way in which one could preserve that over time? That's actually one of the hardest cases of all for libraries. There's a book about a decade ago by Nicholson Baker called Double Fold, which takes librarians to task for not figuring out how to preserve interactive technologies over time. And he's totally right. It has absolutely been unsolved by libraries up to this point. So books is the simple case. It's evocative because we love books, right? And we want to be able to have them in some sense. But I think it is, as you suggest, harder with the more engaging and interactive type technologies, and it's hardest in the context of games.
Are you blaming this on technology or just the business need to solve it?
I'm not blaming anything on technology, I have to say. I think that
it's all solvable.
I think it's solvable. I think going back to our stack, I think it's mostly an institutional problem, and it's one that is a combination of market drivers and the way in which things like copyright work, which is, I think, copyright is not flexible enough in this case to ensure that we have, a digital deposit copy somewhere that we could reformat in the public interest should we need it, right? That just seems to me that's sort of an institutional challenge. So I think with most of these things, and this is not to diminish the work of engineers who do huge Herculean efforts to make things interoperate, I think these are increasingly less technological and data type challenges and more institutional ones, which is a big part of our book. Okay, back to a few hard questions, and then I'll turn it over to you because you've already got great questions going. I think these are the kinds of questions that, to me, are unresolved and come up in each of the hard interop cases. But is how much interoperability and for what purposes? Fundamentally, I don't think it's about interoperability per se, but it's because we're trying to accomplish some other goal, like the preservation of knowledge or improving climate change. How we get there, again, our thesis is that there are lots of different ways to get there, and it's a matter of trying to match the needs with the most effective mechanisms for doing that. In particular, the role of government is, I think, the most controversial and one where I think people disagree most vehemently. Huge differences, as we found, between the US and Europe, and some differences in Asia as well, particularly around when should the government intervene. Should it intervene in legal terms ex ante, before the fact, or ex post, after the fact? Can it do so in a way that's legitimate and, in fact, appropriately? And can they do it in a way that's in fact effective or efficient as compared to various private solutions? And I think the answer is in some cases yes, and in many cases not as effectively. Near the end, how we think about the management of interoperability over time. I think one of the reasons that certain solutions to interop work better than others is because they may persist further over time. If you think about something like small-scale innovation within a single firm, or where two firms work together, that's a really, really good way to get to interoperability very quickly. It may not be the most stable way to get to interoperability ultimately over time. And then last, to end with an academic challenge, it's actually a very hard thing to make the case because there aren't great data. There aren't great, for instance, empirical data across the board about what works, so that we end up having a methodological challenge and work with analogy and case study, which means that on a continuing basis, this is something that we have to keep working at and continue to update the argument as time goes along. Just as a very final note, and then to open it up, I think that for a company like Microsoft or others in the IT space broadly, the core challenge from my perspective is to figure out how to have the right optimal level of interoperability across a bunch of services where you are obviously able to compete and to charge for what you're doing, but also to create that ecosystem that ultimately is going to serve everyone better than having a siloed approach. I think Microsoft's strategy in this respect is exemplary, and we write a fair amount about it in the book and how it's changed over time. I think also there's a huge challenge as we create these very interoperable systems to ensure that things like privacy and security and diversity and lock-in don't become bigger problems than the problem we had before and that we were solving through the interoperability. So I think it's a crucial thing that you have this interop team and that you're thinking about it at this really deep intellectual level. And I'm really grateful to have the chance to play out this argument here in front of you and look forward to your hard questions. Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
So I was wondering if you could talk for a bit about the Oracle versus Google litigation and
Yep.
how, so just as sort of a case study, what did you think about, there's a lot of discussion in that case about embrace and extend, or
Yep.
embrace, extend, and extinguish. I mean, what do you think about what Google did from an interop perspective? They obviously are telling a good story, but
Yep.
Oracle was saying that this was bad for interoperability and incentives in the ecosystem.
I have read most about this from the court. So this is a lawyer's reaction, which is I've read court documents and I read the opinion that came out yesterday. I don't know if you've read it, but I think it's a wonderful opinion, actually, about 40 pages. And ultimately, this was a big win for Google, as you may know, that the court said that across most of these claims, that Oracle may not persist with its patent claims and its copyright claims. They found that there are 9 lines of code that were copied verbatim by Google engineers, which was a mistake. There may or may not be statutory damages, and how those will play out, that'll still be discussed, I guess. But ultimately, it was an exoneration for Google for how it's worked in this particular context, and it has mostly, of course, to do with Java. I happen to side with Google's argument on this one, based on, again, the court documents and having talked to a number of the lawyers involved. My sense is that with any of these interoperability stories, there are 2 sides to it, in the sense that one could say this is an instance in which somebody is not paying appropriately for intellectual property on the one hand, or can say, this was a perfectly rational thing that somebody did in order to, extend an ecosystem, because at these APIs and so forth, you have to be able to do this. I think core to that matter, and the reason why I think the judge got it right, is a little-known intellectual property thing called the merger doctrine. He mentions only twice, but I think there's something to it in this, which is, the judge said, among other things, if you can't get this work done but for kind of, in essence, reverse engineering it and making it work, that there's not a copyright that's protectable in that particular context. I don't think that's the end-all, be-all to all these types of claims, but I think there's something in it, which is, in these highly interoperable systems, I don't think we want a scenario in which we can't, in fact, do the kind of work that Google did vis-a-vis Java in that case. Totally debatable as to whether or not that's good public policy, but I think it ultimately was a great decision. I don't know if they're really fancy lawyers in the room like Tom. I don't know if you disagree with that.
The floor is yours.
Well, I would love to know if you think differently. But.
I haven't read the decision yet, but there are certainly strong public policy reasons why that kind of interoperability should be allowed under copyright law. Yeah. Putting you in a hard spot, but anyway. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. I really like the point that the risk that you mentioned about privacy and security, but there are other issues that I think I would call it safety. Why I'm mentioning it? Because in wireless environment,
yes,
where sensors is everywhere, and things imposed upon people, upon things, are not visible. So there is a safety issues that's involved, where you carry a phone. Some people would say, okay, if I'm listening to talk over the phone or listening to a friend's talk, I got headaches. But there are other things more serious than that. That is, say, safety. That's not just a health issue, but a safety issue that involves the wireless sensoring systems. And it's the benefits. We know that doctor can diagnose
right
collaboratively, despite no matter where they are, where the patients are, they can do it. But the drawback, the risks are really safety. It's almost like as what you just described. They're two-sided stories.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, I don't know the research on whether or not having this too close to my body is really going to be bad for me in 50 years or not. But your point at its core is very well taken, which is that there are obvious benefits, and we do rush to create interoperable systems. Part of our point, of course, is to say let's also look at the outset at what the risks are and see if we can design around them, if we can have interoperability that ultimately is good and safe. And a simpler example maybe of the safety concern is the texting in a car or whatever else, right? We can be charging it in your phone, whatever, and be effectively getting to a place more efficiently and communicating with friends. But obviously, you may kill yourself by virtue of trying to text while you're driving along. So I think there are lots of instances where, whether or not, in fact, the radiation from this is a safety issue, I think we need to be concerned. Yes, ma'am.
Just on that, one of the things I didn't hear a lot being talked about is that law of unintended consequences.
Yep.
Because usually when we're developing, we're kind of like almost like a car driving along a road. We're not like a plane looking at all the other cars, all the other companies that are developing and doing other things. So later down the road, we might realize, we should have gone and done the following things. And even when we get to that point where we realize, we should have put, safety lights here, we should have done the following things, and start to build a system of interoperability. Usually we've gone too far in our own journey, and we probably should have started from where we started. And it gets more complicated because now we've got to start talking to all these different people.
That's exactly right.
And we immediately go to a base level, well I do anyway, where I go to the law of kind of, unintended consequences and edge cases and problems that might arise. And, particularly when you're in a company, you start to think about the legal consequences or compliance requirements or censoring or whatever. And it gets much more complicated. Innovation is a horrible, icky business where you're not really seeing everything until you're further down the road. And, I see your whole point of that problem of the four dimensions, but honestly, I don't know how you devise a system that's forward thinking, because most things are in the rear view mirror.
It's a great point, and I think it is in tension with the way in which we tend to innovate in this country, which is you try to just run like hell and see what comes of it. And in fact, I think that's a great way to innovate. In lots of labs, that's exactly what you do. I think there's only one caveat I would put to that, which is I think it is worth having product counsel around. I actually think the LCA model, where you have some people who look across the board at things like copyright and trade secret and trademark, and you have some people who work with product groups and who at least just kind of say, wait a minute, pay attention to this, up front, and maybe if you do this at the beginning, you're going to save a huge amount down the road. If you have smart people who understand the engineering and you understand the law, I think there's more that can be done by virtue of that partnership, and I think it can be much cheaper. But your point is well taken, right? You can't design for everything at the outset. You would never get the thing going. One of the really good examples that I like a lot from the Interop stories is about air traffic control. This is one that it's just an amazing historical story. So you think about the Wright brothers take off, and there's kind of one plane, you don't really need it, but you start getting more planes, you need to have more effective systems. And what happens is you start having some rules that start to get made, and start thinking about what language people need to talk to one another about, and you have radio helping to work that out. Ultimately, where we've gotten to is a place where all of the people involved in air safety have to speak English, and not only English, a standardized form of English so that there's no mistaking it. That's a form of interoperability at the linguistic layer that's developed over time. It actually works pretty well. But one of the things that we found also is that the interoperability has been locked in at a level from several decades ago. So some people in the Obama administration really wanted, for instance, to introduce some things, pretty simple things like GPS into air traffic control. That hasn't happened, right? Some of the things that would be obvious reforms to air traffic control haven't happened because we got to a place where it's kind of a locked-in level of interoperability. It's good enough interoperability, but it's not as good as it could be, and there are lots of legacy reasons why we don't do that. So your point is incredibly well taken. I certainly don't disagree.
The legal part, that's the reason why 5 out of 6 of those publishers aren't playing.
I think that's partly true and partly not true, having talked to all those publishers about it. I think a lot of it is market risk. They're fearful that if they start down a certain road, set aside what the law says, that they will get locked into a version of selling books that is not as good as other versions. So just take, for example, one of the firms, you may know HarperCollins, started to sell books on a 26-lend basis. Does anybody know this story? They basically said, we will let a library lend. You can buy this book for whatever what they were charging for, and they say, what you can do is you can lend it 26 times. So I lend it to Lily, and then it gets lent to somebody else, and so forth. And then, poof, okay? Yeah, you'd be glad to. Poof, it goes away, DRM, right? And librarians went nuts over this, because HarperCollins' theory was that the book would have been worn out after 26 lends, right? So, because Lily reads it so hard, right? And then the next person, it's obviously stupid. But I think this was it was sort of a market risk problem. They were so burned by this, they kind of pull it back. So yes, obviously the copyright law underlies a lot of this concern, and lawyers are definitely to blame. I actually think it's more the biz dev and the people who figure out the big spreadsheet that are to blame in that case.
What I mean by that is not picking on lawyers, but it's actually a bunch of people who are your counsel of the business reasons plus law. They're usually the people which decide, we're not going to go down this road because there's an unintended consequence here that will come boomerang back on us. And I think that's what kills things.
Did not work well.
well.
That's true. I think that's true.
So is Basic Books, do they have a different kind of policy?
Basic Books sent a person to the meeting we held about this, but I actually don't know if they've changed their policy yet.
Yeah. So we got into this whole thing about interoperability. I would actually like to understand even your definition of interoperability at its pure state, because internally in the Interop team, I always go back and debate what's the difference between interoperability and compatibility. 43 companies developed the DVD standard. The fact that you could take a DVD disc and put it in a player and they both have the same logo and it works, is that compatibility? Because they're both following the same spec, or is that actually interoperability? And so understanding written the book on it, what does that interoperability mean to you?
So I put up the short definition that we had, which was about rendering data usefully across systems. I think that the NIST definition, the sort of longer technical one, is actually is pretty good. Ultimately, we're seeing interoperability, though, in this much broader context of saying that true interoperability is, in fact, about the thing being able to work across different contexts and in a way that humans can understand it and interact with it. So we're actually, I think, having a relatively high bar for it. Is it different than compatibility? Sure. It's a richer and harder thing. Is it different than standardization? Sure. I'm not positive how to answer exactly your the question that you're asking about.
Like a superset of, or is compatibility part of interoperability? Or are they just completely separate things?
I think it's a subset of interoperability. I think standardization and compatibility are subsets of the broader thing of interoperability. Again, I think it's a higher bar than low. Yes, sir.
I'm puzzled by your section on credit cards.
Uh-huh.
I can see I lose privacy when I pay by credit card.
Yes.
As for security, I am most insecure when I pay as George Washington. It's a lot easier to dispute a credit card transaction than a cash transaction.
I think that's a very good point. I think across the system, one could make the argument, though, that security is lower in the credit card context. That the ability, for instance, of Anonymous or somebody else to bring down a system at a much higher level is greater than the small-scale risk that you run as George Washington. But I think that's something we could certainly debate. At which level do we care more about the security? I guess my point in looking at privacy and security is it's not the interoperability per se that leads to higher or lower levels of security or privacy. It's what we do with it, right? Again, I go back to that lab example. You could have a much more secure lab with one entrance or one that has 100 entrances. It depends on lots of other factors. Nick?
I relate to the comment about unintended consequences and innovation. In the case studies that you looked at, are you seeing a trend in a heightened awareness of interoperability and thinking in advance of designing interoperability versus it growing and accidentally getting there? So with the exception maybe of some business models or products that are platform-based that you covered in an example, are we reaching an era because of the nature of the interconnected things today where there's just a heightened awareness, is also exemplified by your book, and more people are thinking about it initially versus trying to catch up after the fact?
I don't think so. I mean, I think in very specific instances of the platform-type businesses and lots of things you guys do, I think there is a heightened awareness, and obviously it's a important competitive question. I don't think systemically we think about it particularly well. So I actually think things like viruses, whether they're like SARS or like flame virus, I don't think we're thinking enough about what those fire breaks look like across complex systems. So, it's hard. Again, there's no empirical data to say we are or are not paying enough attention to it. But I think as we create these much more interconnected, interdependent systems across cultures, I think we need to be much more cognizant about creating those protections. And as part of the purpose of writing a book that's not just for developers is to say that this actually may matter across a broader spectrum of topics. Lily?
So I love the library example. So when you think of education and digital youth and interoperability, are there certain problems that you think would be really fun to look at? I mean, I think the library one is a great example because it's not that obvious unless you're really sort of looking at that, but I know you've thought a lot about education and kids.
You're so nice. Yeah, I mean, if I abstract up one level, which a lot of this is obviously an exercise in abstracting and being academic about it, I'm really interested in the concept of connected learning, the extent to which kids are learning in so many different ways in so many different environments, and that it's much less about the given classroom and the sort of contained space, that it really is happening on the kinds of social networks that you're studying and creating, and that we haven't, as educators, thought enough about that set of connections. And some of the stuff they're learning is bad, right? It's not all good, and there are things that have to be unlearned in that environment, just as there are in the classroom. So I think of it as an interop story in the sense of thinking about how all of these different learning environments interoperate in a way that gets us to our pedagogical goals, and recognizing that it's not so much just about that one teacher who's at the front of the room able to guide a conversation or to help inform a kid about a given topic. It's much, much, much more distributed and complex a learning environment today. And I think that puts real pressure on learning institutions to do a better job of seeing it as a complex system and then seeing where the points of intervention could be. That's not a precise answer, but it's an inspired one in the sense that I'm really excited to work on it. So, seems like maybe we have exhausted our questions, but I'm really grateful for the chance to have this conversation, and thank you for having me here at MSR.
Oh, thank
Take care.
you.
Thanks.